It is roughly 170,000 years ago on the African savannah, and you are technically a human. At no point this morning does the thought pants cross your mind. And yet here we are, billions of people every single morning putting on trousers or skirts or something that started life as pajamas 3 days ago and has since been quietly promoted to loungewear. Clothing is so deeply built into human life that entire legal systems exist specifically to police the absence of it. We have laws about how naked a person is allowed to be in public. Think about how strange that actually is. No other animal on this planet has ever needed that law. Dogs do not wear clothes. Wolves do not wear clothes. An elephant, an animal capable of genuine problem-solving and grief, has never once looked at a cold morning and reached for a jacket. So why us? When did this actually start, and why did one single species decide that being naked required legislation? The honest answer involves lice. Genuinely, stay with it, because the detective work behind that answer is one of the strangest, most quietly brilliant pieces of forensic science in all of anthropology. Start with the fact most people never actually stop to notice. Humans are nearly the only large mammal on Earth walking around almost hairless. Gorillas, fully covered. Chimpanzees, fully covered. Bears, wolves, horses, lions, hippos, elephants, every one of them, across wildly different climates, wrapped in a full coat of fur or hide. And then there is us, conspicuously smooth, patchy in places, an evolutionary look that reads less like a design choice and more like an unfinished draft. The leading explanation researchers point to is thermoregulation. As early human ancestors moved out of dense forest and into open grassland, chasing prey across long distances on foot, a thick coat of fur became a genuine liability, trapping heat, slowing the body down, risking a fatal overheat before the hunt was ever finished. So, gradually, across hundreds of thousands of years, humans traded fur for an almost absurd number of sweat glands instead, somewhere between 2 and 4 million of them, more than nearly any other animal alive, a genuinely elite cooling system built directly into the skin. Fantastic in summer heat, considerably less fantastic when the temperature drops far below freezing and your entire cooling system has nothing left to insulate you, which is exactly where the next part of this story picks up. The tidy, obvious explanation writes itself from there. Humans got cold, wrapped themselves in animal skins, problem solved. Except the actual timeline refuses to cooperate with that story. Genetic evidence, which is coming up shortly, suggests clothing was already in regular use somewhere between 100,000 and 170,000 years ago. But modern humans did not begin migrating out of Africa in any significant numbers until roughly 70,000 years ago. If clothing were purely a response to cold climates, it should not be showing up in the evidence tens of thousands of years before anyone actually reached a cold climate to respond to. Something else was clearly going on first, something that had less to do with the weather and considerably more to do with who humans already were as a species, long before the first person ever shivered through a genuinely brutal winter. A 5-year-old could sketch out the cold weather explanation in 10 seconds. The actual dates simply refuse to agree with it, and once you notice that mismatch, the whole tidy, obvious version of this story quietly starts to fall apart under its own weight. Which brings us to the lice. Researchers at the University of Florida, doing exactly the kind of painstaking genetic detective work that rarely makes headlines, decided to map the evolutionary history of human lice, and in doing so stumbled onto one of the strangest pieces of evidence in this entire field. Humans host 2 genetically distinct populations of lice: head lice, which live in hair, and body lice, which live specifically inside clothing, in the seams and folds of fabric, and which cannot survive on bare skin at all. Body lice evolved directly from head lice at one specific evolutionary branching point, and that branching point could only have happened once there was consistent clothing available to create an entirely new habitat for a parasite to move into. Warm, sheltered, and completely inaccessible to any louse still confined to bare skin. When researchers calculated the timing of that genetic split, they landed on a window between roughly 83,000 and 170,000 years ago. A parasite, one of the most universally despised organisms in human history, ended up accidentally preserving the earliest hard evidence of when humans started getting dressed, encoded directly into its own DNA, long before anyone thought to look for that evidence anywhere near an actual textile. If clothing predates the migration out of Africa by tens of thousands of years, Warmth cannot have been the original driver. So what was? The first candidate is refreshingly unglamorous. Basic physical protection, not from cold, but from sun, biting insects, thorns, and general abrasion. Walking daily through tall grass and scrubland while tracking game. A simple hide wrap creates a real, meaningful barrier against exactly the kind of small cuts and irritations that, left unprotected, can turn into serious infections over time. The second candidate is where things get genuinely interesting. Social signaling. Humans are compulsively hierarchical, constantly broadcasting status, group identity, and intent through posture, expression, and appearance. Doing it with hairstyles, tattoos, voice, and quite possibly from very early on, with whatever they chose to drape over their own bodies. There is solid evidence that ochre pigment was already being used for body decoration as far back as 200,000 years ago, predating even the earliest lice-based evidence for clothing itself, which suggests the impulse to visually communicate something about yourself to the group may be older than clothing altogether, and the leap from painting your skin to wearing a particular hide in a particular way, for a particular reason, is not a large cognitive jump at all. For most of early human history, clothing was almost certainly rough. A hide draped over the shoulders, tied with a length of twisted sinew, roughly trimmed with a stone flake. Functional, not remotely fitted. Somewhere around 50,000 years ago, the archaeological record changes noticeably. Researchers start finding actual eye needles, not simple pointed awls for punching holes, but needles with a small bored eye designed specifically for threading fiber and stitching material together with real precision. The oldest, confirmed example, found in Denisova Cave in Siberia, is carved from the hollow bone of a bird and polished to a fineness that is genuinely striking for its age. Someone looked at a sliver of bone, imagined a tool that did not yet exist, figured out how to bore a clean hole through its narrowest point without shattering it, and used the finished object to join two pieces of material with a controlled repeatable stitch. That is not blind survival instinct. That is design thinking, problem solving through imagination rather than brute force. And in a Siberian glacial winter, properly fitted, sealed clothing was not a luxury. It was the difference between living through the season and not, and pottery, cave paintings, and most other artifacts from that era simply were not optional in the same life or death way that a functioning needle was. Here is a detail that often gets quietly dropped from this story, mostly because it complicates the version where modern humans invented everything first. Neanderthals were also making and wearing clothing, and doing so well before they ever encountered Homo sapiens at all. Researchers have found substantial evidence of Neanderthals systematically processing animal hides, using stone tools specifically shaped for scraping and working leather, and butchering carcasses in patterns that suggest the skin mattered every bit as much as the meat. Neanderthal anatomy itself, stockier builds, shorter limbs, different fat distribution, points towards serious, sustained cold adaptation, the kind that makes clothing essential, rather than optional. And in that same Siberian cave, in the very same layers as the eye needle, researchers found pierced and polished ornaments belonging to the Denisovans, the mysterious third human lineage identified only in 2010 from a single finger bone. A population we barely understand was already thinking about decoration, symbolism, and quite possibly how a garment looked, not just what it did. The impulse to clothe the body, it turns out, was never exclusively ours, which raises an uncomfortable but genuinely fascinating question. Is clothing a specifically human invention, or simply the obvious solution any sufficiently intelligent, sufficiently cold hominin was always going to land on? Given enough time and enough hands capable of scraping a hide? Step back, and the strangest thing about human clothing is not that we wear it, it is what we immediately did with it. If clothing were purely practical, every culture would eventually converge on the single most thermally efficient option for its climate and simply stop innovating. That is not remotely what happened. In every culture on record, clothing carries symbolic weight that goes far beyond keeping anyone warm or protected. Priests dressed differently than warriors. Rulers wore garments nobody else was permitted to touch. The dead were buried in specific clothing suited to their status and whatever journey was believed to follow. Some of the oldest surviving textile fragments were not left in their natural color. They were deliberately dyed in multiple shades by someone who looked at a perfectly functional piece of woven material and decided it needed to say something different instead. No other animal does this. A cuttlefish changes color reflexively. Neither one is choosing what to communicate based on culture, history, or personal narrative, and neither will ever decide tomorrow's display should mean something different from today's. That is entirely uniquely ours, and it likely started the moment someone first smeared themselves with ochre and felt something shift about how they understood their place among everyone else around the fire. Whatever clothing started out meaning warmth became a matter of survival extremely fast. Between roughly 120,000 and 70,000 years ago, Earth cycled through a series of brutal glacial periods. Global temperatures collapsed, ice sheets expanded dramatically, huge stretches of Africa turned hyper-arid, lakes disappeared, and food sources crashed along with them. Genetic evidence suggests the entire human population may have fallen to somewhere between 10 and 30,000 individuals at its lowest point, a number that puts our own species uncomfortably close to simply not making it. For the survivors, and especially for the groups eventually pushing north into Europe and east into Central Asia, clothing stopped being a social signal or a minor comfort. It became the thin, literal line between staying alive and not. A properly constructed, fitted, layered, stitched garment traps warm air against the body and protects exactly the places, wrists, neck, where heat escapes fastest, allowing survival in conditions that would otherwise kill an unclothed person within hours. The groups who had already mastered that specific technology had an advantage almost too large to overstate, and every single person alive today descends from someone who had it, someone who had already solved the clothing problem before the climate ever forced the issue, and simply happened to be ready when it did. There is a quieter transition in this story that rarely gets its own dramatic moment: the shift from animal hide to woven plant fiber. Hides are warm, durable, and water-resistant, but heavy, stiff, and require killing an animal to obtain in the first place. At some point, humans began spinning plant fiber into thread and twisting it into cord instead, eventually weaving it into actual fabric. The oldest confirmed twisted plant fiber, found in a cave in the country of Georgia, dates to roughly 30,000 years ago, and, notably, it was already dyed in multiple colors, decorative and intentional, from essentially the very beginning. By the time of the Neolithic agricultural revolution, roughly 10,000 years BCE onward, textile production had become one of the core technologies of human civilization. Flax for linen, wool from domesticated sheep, eventually cotton and silk, each culture independently developing its own version of the same basic idea. And with textiles came something genuinely new: the wardrobe, clothing specialized by purpose rather than a single all-purpose wrap. A heavy cloak for winter, a light garment for summer, specific dress for ritual, mourning, or status. Long before any industrial revolution mechanized it, the textile trade was already one of the most significant economic forces on the planet, financing empires and shaping entire trade routes across continents. Put all of it together, and the honest answer is not a single clean reason, the kind that fits neatly into one sentence for a textbook. It is several overlapping ones, arriving in waves, driven by biology, culture, climate, and social complexity all at once. It likely began as basic physical protection, a barrier between skin and thorn, sun and biting insect, unglamorous but genuinely useful. It became social signaling almost immediately afterward, a way of saying something about identity in a species obsessed with status and belonging, long before anyone needed it for warmth at all. It turned into a genuine survival technology the moment the climate turned hostile enough to demand it, separating those who made it through a population bottleneck from those who did not. And it became an art form, an industry, and a language as human culture grew more complex than any single practical need could explain on its own, layering meaning on top of meaning until the original simple problem, thorns and sunburn, was almost entirely buried under everything clothing eventually came to represent. Given who we actually are as a species, hierarchical, symbolic, freezing half the time, and endlessly inventive under pressure, clothing was probably never avoidable. It was closer to inevitable, the kind of invention that would have shown up eventually no matter which specific group of hominins happened to get there first. Whatever you are wearing right now, you made a series of choices, conscious and unconscious, about what to put on your own body today. And those choices say something about who you are, Exactly the way a hide dyed a particular color once said something about someone standing around a fire 150,000 years ago, long before either of you had any language to explain why it mattered. That is the thread, quite literally, connecting you to them without a single interruption across every generation in between. They got dressed, and so, this morning, without thinking twice about it, did you.